I didn't notice him the first time my daughter mentioned his name. That's how small it started. Just a passing comment while she stood in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, barely looking up. She said something like, "I might bring someone over this weekend," in that casual tone she used when she didn't want questions. I remember nodding, not really listening. I was rinsing a plate that was already clean, just to have something to do with my hands. The house was quiet like it always was. Too quiet. Back then, weekends didn't mean much to me anymore. They used to. Years ago, Saturdays were full, errands, laughter, cooking too much food, waiting for my husband to come home early for once. But somewhere along the way, weekends just became longer versions of weekdays. Empty. Predictable. Forgettable. So when she said she was bringing someone over, it didn't register as anything important. Just another visitor passing through a house that didn't feel like it belonged to anyone anymore. I didn't even ask his name. That was my first mistake. By the time Saturday came, I had already forgotten about it. I spent most of the morning moving from room to room, straightening things that didn't need straightening. It's a habit you pick up when you don't have much else to fill your time. You convince yourself you're being productive, but really, you're just trying not to sit still too long. Because when you sit still, you think. And thinking was something I had learned to avoid. My marriage had become quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet people talk about like it's a good thing. This was different. This was the kind of silence that builds walls between two people without either of them noticing until it's too late. We didn't argue anymore. We didn't laugh either. We just existed around each other. He left early, came back late, ate, watched TV, slept, repeat. At some point, we stopped asking each other how our day was. Not because anything bad happened, but because neither of us really cared about the answer anymore. That realization doesn't hit you all at once. It settles in slowly, like dust. And before you know it, you're living in it. So by the time I heard the front door open that afternoon, I was in the living room, pretending to read a book I hadn't actually turned a page of in over 20 minutes. I heard her voice first, lighter than usual, almost excited. That caught my attention. Then I heard his. Deep. Calm. Polite. Different. I don't know why that made me look up. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just something new breaking the routine. Or maybe it was something else I didn't want to name yet. They walked in together, and that was the first time I saw him. And for a second, just a second, I forgot what I was supposed to do. He wasn't what I expected. I don't know what I did expect, honestly. But it wasn't him. There was something steady about him. Not loud. Not trying too hard. Just present. The kind of presence you notice without understanding why. My daughter was talking, of course she was, but I wasn't really hearing her anymore. I was focused on him. The way he stood. The way he looked around the room like he was taking everything in without being obvious about it. Then his eyes met mine. And that moment lasted just a little too long. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But long enough for me to. "Mom," my daughter said, snapping me out of it. That's when I finally heard his name. And when he stepped forward to greet me, polite, respectful, just like you'd expect, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit yet. The house didn't feel as quiet anymore. And that should have meant nothing. But somehow, it didn't. I told myself it was nothing. That's the first thing you do in situations like this. You minimize it before it even has a chance to become something real. You label it early so you don't have to question it later. He was just my daughter's boyfriend. That was the truth. Simple, clear, safe. And I held onto that thought the rest of the afternoon like it was something solid, something dependable. Because the alternative, the idea that there was anything else going on beneath the surface, wasn't something I was ready to look at. So I stayed polite, distant, appropriate. I asked the usual questions. Where he was from, what he studied, what he planned to do after. The kind of surface-level conversation that keeps things moving without letting anything settle too deeply. He answered calmly, respectfully. But what I noticed, what I couldn't stop noticing, was how present he was when he spoke. He didn't rush his words, didn't fidget, didn't glance at his phone every few seconds like most people his age did. He listened. That stood out more than it should have. At some point, my daughter drifted off to her room to grab something, leaving the two of us alone in the living room. It wasn't planned. It just happened. And suddenly, the air felt different. Not heavy. Not uncomfortable. Just aware. I stood up almost immediately, as if sitting there would somehow make it worse. "I'll get you something to drink," I said, even though neither of us had asked for anything. He nodded. "Thank you." Simple. Normal. But when I turned my back and walked into the kitchen, I realized my heartbeat had picked up just slightly. That annoyed me. I busied myself with the fridge longer than necessary, staring at shelves I had already memorized. Juice? Water? Soda? None of it required this much thought. But I needed the extra seconds. To reset. To remind myself who I was. By the time I came back, I had my composure again. Or at least, I thought I did. I handed him the drink, careful not to let my fingers brush his. It felt deliberate, even though I tried to act like it wasn't. "Thanks," he said again, and this time, he held my gaze just a second longer than before. There it was again. That moment. Small. Quiet. Easy to ignore. But not invisible. I sat back down, this time on the chair across from him instead of beside him. Distance felt safer. Necessary. "So how long have you two been seeing each other?" I asked. He leaned back slightly, thinking. "A few months now." A few months. I glanced toward the hallway where my daughter had disappeared. Somehow, that detail bothered me more than it should have. Not because of him, but because she hadn't mentioned it sooner. Or maybe she had, and I just hadn't been paying attention. That thought sat with me longer than I liked. "You didn't tell me that," I said when she finally came back, trying to keep my tone light. She shrugged. "I did." "You probably just forgot." She smiled when she said it, but it didn't feel like a joke. And the worst part? She was probably right. That realization hit harder than anything else that day. Because it forced me to confront something I had been quietly avoiding. I hadn't just drifted away from my husband. I had drifted away from my own life. From my daughter. From everything. And now, here I was, sitting across from someone who, for no good reason, had managed to pull my attention back in a way nothing else had in a long time. That should have been a warning sign. Instead, it felt like relief. The rest of the evening passed normally on the surface. They laughed, watched something on TV, shared inside jokes I didn't understand. I stayed nearby, pretending to be occupied with small things, folding laundry, checking my phone, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. but I was aware of him the entire time. Of where he was. Of when he spoke. Of when he laughed. It wasn't intentional. I didn't choose it. It just happened. And I hated how natural it felt. At one point, I caught him looking at me again. Not long. Not obvious. Just enough. I looked away first. That should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment I shut it down completely, drew a firm line in my mind, and reminded myself exactly what this was and what it wasn't. But I didn't. Instead, I went to bed that night with something unfamiliar sitting quietly in the back of my thoughts. Not guilt. Not yet. Just awareness. And the unsettling realization that something had shifted. Not outside, but inside me. And I wasn't sure how to shift it back. The next time I saw him, it wasn't planned. That's how it kept happening, small, unplanned moments that didn't feel important at first, but somehow stayed with me longer than they should have. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Quiet, like always. My daughter had classes, and the house had settled back into its usual stillness. I was in the kitchen again, same routine, same movements, when I heard the front door open. At first, I assumed it was her. But then I heard his voice. Soft. Careful. Hello. I froze for a second, my hand still resting on the counter. He wasn't supposed to be there. Or maybe he was, and I just didn't know. That seemed to be happening a lot lately. I stepped out of the kitchen, and there he was, standing just inside the doorway like he wasn't sure how far in he was allowed to go. I'm sorry, he said quickly when he saw me. She told me I could come by. I think she left something for me. His tone was respectful, almost cautious. Like he didn't want to overstep. It's fine, I said, a little too quickly. Then I softened it. She didn't tell me, but it's fine. There was a brief pause. The kind where both people are trying to decide what comes next. She should be back soon, I added. He nodded. I can wait. And just like that, he stepped further inside. It should have felt normal. There was nothing wrong with it. But something about him being there, without my daughter, without that buffer, changed the atmosphere completely. It felt closer. I gestured toward the living room. You can sit. Thank you. He sat, but not fully relaxed. There was still that awareness about him, like he was measuring his presence in the space. I went back to the kitchen, but I didn't really leave. Not mentally. I could feel him there. And that feeling made it impossible to focus on anything else. After a minute or two, I gave up pretending and came back out. Do you want something to drink? I asked again. It was becoming a pattern. He smiled slightly this time. Sure. There was something about that smile. It wasn't big or showy. Just small. Real. I brought him water. This time, when I handed it to him, our fingers did brush. Just slightly. Barely anything. But it lingered. Not physically. Just in my head. Thanks, he said again, and there was something quieter in his voice now. I sat down across from him, like before. Same distance. Same attempt at control. But it didn't feel the same. So, how did you two meet? I asked, even though I was sure I'd heard the story already. I helped her with something at school, he said. It just kind of went from there. I nodded. Simple. Natural. The way most things start. There was a pause after that. Not awkward. Just open. And for some reason, I didn't rush to fill it this time. Neither did he. We just sat there for a moment, looking at each other without really meaning to. And then, "I didn't expect you to be home," he said. It was a harmless comment, but something about the way he said it made it feel like more than that. "I usually am," I replied. Another pause. Slightly heavier this time. "I guess I just didn't picture it," he added. I tilted my head slightly. "Didn't picture what?" He hesitated. "Not long. Just enough to make it noticeable." "You," he said. It wasn't said in a way that crossed a line. There was no tone behind it. But the meaning still landed. And for the first time, I felt it clearly. That shift I had been trying to ignore. That quiet tension that had been building in small, almost invisible ways. It was there. Between us. Unspoken. But understood. I should have redirected the conversation. Changed the subject. Created distance. That's what any sensible person would do. Instead, I asked, "What do you mean?" Even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was stepping closer to something I didn't fully understand. Or maybe I did. He looked at me for a second, like he was deciding how honest to be. Then he shrugged slightly. "I don't know. You just seem different from what I expected." That word again. Different. It shouldn't have mattered. But it did. More than I wanted to admit. "How?" I asked quietly. Another pause. Longer this time. And then he said it. "More present." It was such a simple word. But it hit harder than anything else. Because it wasn't true. Not really. I hadn't been present in my own life for a long time. And yet, somehow, in that moment, sitting across from him, I was. Fully. Uncomfortably. Aware. Before I could respond, we heard the front door open again. My daughter's voice filled the space, breaking whatever had been forming between us. And just like that, it was gone. Or at least, it went back to hiding. He stood up almost immediately, stepping back into his place, her boyfriend, nothing more. I stayed seated for a second longer, steadying myself. Resetting. By the time she walked into the room, everything looked normal again. And maybe, to her, it was. But as I watched them together, laughing, talking like nothing had happened, I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't just in my head. And that made it dangerous. Not because of what had happened, but because of how close it was getting to something that shouldn't happen at all. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I trusted myself to keep it from crossing that line. After that day, everything felt different, even when nothing outwardly changed. I tried to act normal. I reminded myself he was my daughter's boyfriend. I reminded myself of the line I couldn't cross. I reminded myself of the life I had built, the years I had invested in a marriage that wasn't exciting anymore, but was safe. And yet, he kept appearing in my thoughts. Unexpectedly. Sometimes when I was cooking. Sometimes when I heard the door open in the street below. Sometimes when I just sat still and let the quiet settle in the house, like I always did. The tension wasn't just physical. It wasn't even really about him. It was about the emptiness that had been waiting for someone to notice. It was about being seen. Being acknowledged. Being remembered as a woman, not just a mother or a wife. And the truth was, he did that, without trying, without even knowing. It came to a head one late evening. My daughter was at a friend's, my husband away on some business trip that had been stretched for weeks. I was alone in the living room, and I heard the front door open softly. Not the usual creak. Not hurried. Soft. Careful. He stepped in. We froze in that quiet way that makes you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't close. He wasn't touching. He wasn't anything. But the air between us was charged, thick with the small moments that had been accumulating for weeks. Every glance, every pause, every polite smile that had lingered longer than it should. I just wanted to drop this off, he said, holding a small package from my daughter. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Thank you. We stood there. Too close. Not close enough. The kind of distance that made you aware of your own hands, your own chest, your own presence in ways that were unfamiliar. And then, almost like a signal from some hidden part of my conscience, I stepped back. Just enough to reset. I should let you go, I said. He nodded, and without another word, he left. The door closed behind him, and I was alone again. But the difference this time was that I felt it, the pull, the temptation, the almost that could have been. And I also felt relief. Relief that I had stopped it. Relief that I hadn't crossed a line. Relief that I could still recognize the boundary between what's fleeting desire and what's actually right. I realized something that night. Desire can sneak in quietly, almost like a friend, almost like a harmless visitor. And the real strength is noticing it before it becomes a choice you regret. I sat in the dark living room, listening to the quiet, finally letting it settle without trying to fill it with meaningless tasks. I let myself think about it, about him, about myself, about what it meant to feel seen again after so long. And I promised myself I would not let it go further. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I did. And because sometimes, knowing where to stop is the truest measure of control you have over your own life. I never told anyone, not my daughter, not my husband, not even a friend. But that experience stayed with me. A quiet reminder that life can surprise you in the most unlikely ways, that attention can feel intoxicating, and that boundaries matter more than the thrill of breaking them. And sometimes, almost having something, almost crossing the line, teaches you more than actually doing it ever could.